We thought we were grieving in peace, until the painting started watching us. Not with horror, not with ghosts, but with something worse. Memory, regret, blood. This isn't a story about hauntings. It's a story about what happens when a family paints over the past, and what we uncover when we finally peel the truth off the wall. I never imagined a set of framed faces could feel like thunder before I held the first of those portraits in my trembling hands, inherited in the aftermath of the one phone call that shattered our lives, the call that told us Mother was gone. And standing alone in the musty receiving room of that colonial house on Maple Street, with its peeling wallpaper and heavy drapes, the portraits arrived as silent witnesses. 6 of them at first, oil-painted figures staring out with impossible gravity, their eyes seeming to hold too much sorrow, too much understanding of grief, as though they'd known loss long before we ever had, and now sat there to mark our pain. I lifted the first portrait out of the worn crate, feeling the tack-sharp weight of age and memory in the canvas. My breath caught because of a woman in it, a young woman in sepia tones, hair pulled back, dressed in a white lace gown, had the same ghost-white complexion my sister Anna inherited, and the same lost sadness in her eyes that Anna carries down the hallway when she thinks no one's watching. I remember how Anna caught me watching and quickly looked away, her own grief mirrored, and in that moment the world cracked open and the portraits ceased to feel like objects and became confessions, each brushstroke a secret I could practically taste on my tongue. The house smelled of old wood and stove smoke. The floors creaked with each step I took carrying each frame to the wall of our living room gallery, the dim light flickering through the dusty windows as if reluctant to reveal what lay written in oils. My father silent behind me, fists clenched at his sides, tears unshed, his jaw set in that familiar way before he retreats into work or whiskey, a man who feels everything too late. And me. I stood frozen, caught between the urge to flee and the urgent need to understand why these portraits arrived now, after Mother's death, and why each painted face seemed to hold knowledge of that final night. Why the youngest portrait, a boy with a shock of dark curls and haunted eyes, looked out at me as if pleading be seen, to be remembered. It was not the house that haunted us, not shadows or creaking doors, but these painted figures who bore witness as we unpacked boxes of our belongings, whose silent gazes pressed on our hearts harder than any whisper in the dark. The painter, unknown, had captured something real and unbearable, familiarities in jawlines and the soft curves of mouths, something that made me think these were not strangers at all, but family we had never met, or worse, family we had forgotten. My Aunt Miriam, Mother's only sister and estranged for decades, had sent them, her scrawled letter crumpled in my pocket, just a few cryptic lines about how they had always belonged to our side of the family, that Mother had once insisted they be destroyed, and now that she was gone, Miriam no longer saw a reason to keep them hidden. Hidden! That word stayed with me longer than the others. The idea that these portraits had been concealed for years, decades, perhaps longer, and only now returned, nestled in crates as though carrying a burden none of us asked for but all of us now had to bear. Anna tried to ignore them at first, choosing to hide herself in the attic bedroom, burying her grief in long nights with music and old books, her eyes hollow, sleep elusive, but even she could not pretend forever, and I caught her once, standing before the portrait of the stern man in a black overcoat, her fingers lightly brushing the corner of the frame, her lips moving without sound as if asking him something, as if begging him for an answer. The house, inherited from our grandfather who died when we were small, had always felt heavy with memories, but now that weight became nearly suffocating. These faces multiplied their presence with every day that passed, demanding to be looked at, to be acknowledged. Father began drinking again, more than before, and each night I'd hear the bottle clink against the kitchen counter, his chair scraping back as he sat in the dark, a single lamp on, staring at the portraits as if daring them to speak. Sometimes he muttered, and once, just once, I heard him whisper Mother's name, not with longing, but with dread. None of us talked about it, not Anna, not Father, not me. But there was something unspoken in our house now, a quiet hysteria that threaded through the halls, and was the kind you don't cure with logic or reason, but with silence, with denial, with pretending things are fine when they're not. We should question more. Why Mother hated them. Why she told Miriam to destroy them. Why Miriam, now elderly and alone in that house upstate, suddenly changed her mind after decades of obedience. I wrote her once, A letter I never mailed, asking her if she ever looked into their eyes for too long, if she ever felt watched, if she ever heard silence speak louder than sound. The days stretched long and listless after the funeral, and though the community came with casseroles and quiet condolences, none of their words landed in the hollow spaces where our mother used to be. She was the center, the one who laughed at the absurd, the one who pulled us together when we drifted apart. And now we were adrift with only the walls and the painted faces to remember who we had been. One evening, the sky bleeding purple outside and a house filled with the scent of Anna's forgotten tea kettle burning on the stove, I noticed something odd in the corner of the portrait of the young girl with braids. The kind of detail you don't see until you look 100 times. A small, near-invisible signature. Not at the bottom as expected, but hidden near the neckline of her dress. A string of initials in faded red that made my skin crawl. I didn't know why. Not then. But something in those initials sparked a memory I couldn't place. Something that whispered in the back of my mind like a child calling from another room. When I asked Father if he recognized the name, he shook his head too quickly and changed the subject. Later that night, I found him in the basement, alone with the crate the portraits had come in, his hands dirty from digging through the packing straw, his face pale and drawn. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, something between guilt and recognition, and then walked past me up the stairs, not speaking a word. I should have followed him. I should have asked, but I didn't. Instead, I sat on the cold floor beside the open crate and stared at the emptiness it now held. Tried to understand what it meant that these portraits arrived not just as gifts, not just as inheritance, but as burdens. And still, the portraits watched, their eyes following us, not with supernatural malice, but with something worse, a knowing, as if they knew what was coming, as if they remembered everything we had forgotten. IT started subtly at first, a kind of creeping awareness that seemed to settle over the house like dust, barely noticeable unless you were really looking. Or rather, unless you were being looked at, and that's exactly how it began to feel, like every room in the house held an audience of silent judges, always present, always watching. It was the portraits, of course, those oil-painted relics from another time that sat too still, too perfect, their eyes rendered with such eerie precision that you began to wonder what the artist saw in them that we couldn't, or worse, what the artist saw in us. I'd catch myself hesitating in the hallway at night, reluctant to pass the wall where the portraits now hung, because there was this unbearable tension in my chest, like holding my breath before walking into a room you know you're not supposed to enter. And though I told myself it was just grief, just a weight of mourning and stress and change, I knew it wasn't that simple, because Anna was changing too. She who used to sleep through anything now woke from shallow dreams covered in sweat, whispering fragments of sentences she didn't remember in the morning. And when I asked her about it, her face would go blank in that unnerving way, eyes flicking just past me as if something else had caught her attention, like the movement of a shadow on the wall or the breath of wind that never seemed to reach the curtains. She stopped going outside. The backyard, once our only refuge after the funeral, lay untouched, the patio furniture slowly gathering mildew, the swing creaking quietly whenever the breeze pushed through the overgrown trees. She said the light out there was wrong, too yellow, too hard, and I didn't know how to respond to that. Didn't know how to interpret her sudden stillness, except to watch her grow paler and thinner and more withdrawn by the day. And even when I suggested taking the portraits down, just for a while, just until things felt normal again, she looked at me like I'd asked her to burn a holy text, her voice sharp and dry, saying, "They're part of the house now." And the words chilled me not because they were strange, but because she said it with such certainty, like someone repeating a truth they didn't remember learning but always knew. My father, too, was unraveling, but his descent was quieter, more methodical. He stopped going to work, made excuses over phone, spent his hours pacing from room to room like a man searching for something he wasn't sure existed, his eyes darting to the portraits like they might offer him answers he'd forgotten how to ask. Sometimes I'd find him sitting in the den, the portrait of the older woman with silver hair directly in front of him, and he'd just stare motionless, a glass of untouched, whiskey in his hand, and the stereo playing old jazz records he used to save for Sunday mornings, the notes looping endlessly until even the saxophone sounded like a warning. He wouldn't talk about Mother anymore. Not when I asked about the last night. Not when I brought up the letter from Miriam. Not when I questioned why the attic door had been left open one morning when I was sure I'd locked it. He just shook his head and said something about the past needing to stay buried, about how some memories aren't worth digging up, but his hands trembled and his eyes darted as he said it. And I realized he wasn't warning me out of logic. He was begging me out of fear. It was during one of those nights, when the house had gone too still and the air pressed down like a held breath, that I sat alone in the hallway, back pressed to the cold floorboards, staring up at the portrait of the boy with the dark curls, the one that unsettled me most, the one whose eyes seemed to follow me with a kind of desperate intensity that made my stomach knot. His was the only portrait that hadn't gathered any dust, not a single speck, as though the air itself was too afraid to settle on his frame. And I found myself whisper without realizing it, asking questions I didn't expect answers to. Who are you? Why are you here? What did she try to forget? And as I sat there in the flickering light of the hallway sconce, I swear something in my memory tugged like a loose thread. An image of photograph I had once seen in Mother's old family albums, long before the fire that ruined half our storage boxes. A black and white picture of a little boy in front of an old farmhouse, his curls wild, his eyes just like this. It couldn't be coincidence. But when I looked for the album the next day, it was gone, not just missing from the shelf, but completely vanished. And no one claimed to have touched it, not Anna, not Father, not even Miriam when I called her and asked directly. She laughed nervously and told me to stop digging into things that wouldn't help me sleep at night. And that's when I started to feel it. Not just the watching, but the erosion, the slow disintegration of time and memory inside our home, like something was chipping away at the edges of our reality, scraping paint off our family history until all that was left were the eyes, always the eyes, watching from the walls and whispering in the silence between our words. And yet we didn't leave. None of us even spoke about leaving. It's strange how quickly you can normalize discomfort, how easily dread becomes the wallpaper of your days. And that's what we did. We let the portraits become part of the furniture, part of the family. And even when I started catching Anna standing for long stretches in front of the large one in the dining room, her hands hanging limp at her sides and her lips barely moving, I said nothing because what could I say? That we were scared of paint? That oil and canvas made us feel unsafe? It sounded ridiculous even in my own head. And yet I knew something was wrong. Something deep and quiet and sharp, like the slow pull of a current under still water. Then came the sound. Not voices, not footsteps, but something worse, a low hum, almost imperceptible, that began to rise in the house during the night. A vibration more than a noise, like the sound of electricity behind the walls, or a breath behind your ear when no one is there. I thought I was imagining it until I saw Anna press her palms to her ears one night, shaking her head violently like she was trying to throw something off, her eyes wide and terrified, whispering, "Make it stop." And for a moment, just a breath of a second, I thought the eyes in the portraits were brighter, like they reflected a light source that didn't exist in the room, and I knew then that this was no ordinary art, no decorative inheritance. These were memories made manifest, grief painted into permanence, and we were living inside a gallery of someone else's regret. And still, we stayed. The realization crept in slowly, not with the jolt of sudden discovery, but like the gradual fog that seeps into every corner of your mind until you can't tell what's real and what's just been there so long you've forgotten how to question it. And that was how I first began to notice the resemblances, the fragments of something eerily familiar in the portraits' faces, not just in the one that resembled Anna or the boy with the haunted gaze, but in all of them, as if these weren't just strangers immortalized in oil, but echoes of people I should have known, could have known, if time or circumstance had taken even the smallest turn in a different direction. I started spending more time in the attic, not the creaky top floor where Anna had isolated herself, but the lower storage space beneath the rafters, where old trunks and forgotten boxes were stacked like tombstones of another era, the air thick with mothballs and mildew, and the silence broken only by the occasional soft thud of the house settling into its grief. I dug through everything, yearbooks, yellowed newspapers, brittle photo albums wrapped in twine, and though the dust clung to my clothes and the air burned my lungs, I kept going, driven by something I didn't yet understand but couldn't ignore, and that's when I found the first real connection. A letter, folded neatly inside a weathered notebook, addressed to my mother and dated nearly 20 years ago, from someone named Daniel who signed off not with love, but with regret, his words shaky and overwritten in places where the ink had bled. saying things like, I had to leave because I knew what happened, and they belong to you now whether you want them or not. And I remember sitting there on the floor with a letter in my lap and a numbness spreading up my arms, not from fear, but from the terrible intimacy of reading something never meant for me, a piece of my mother's hidden history unraveling in my hands. I showed it to Anna, thinking it would pull her back to herself, thinking it might spark something in her that could help me make sense of what we were living inside, but she only stared at it blankly, then turned away, whispering that she already knew. I asked her what that meant, how she could know and never tell me. But she just shook her head, eyes rimmed red, and said, You weren't supposed to see them. None of us were. And I felt something crack in me. Not anger, not yet, but a dawning sense that I had been protected from something for so long that its eventual appearance was now unbearable. That night, I went through the portraits again, this time documenting them in detail, sketching each face in a notebook, listing features, matching them against the old photographs I had found, the school rosters, the family reunion clippings, anything I could get my hands on, and slowly the names began to emerge. Judith, born 1912, died 1937, suicide, according to the clipped obituary hidden in the lining of an old jewelry box. Bernard, the one in the overcoat, had served in the war but returned, broken, his face gone in the photograph, but nearly identical to the portrait on our wall. And the girl with the braids, her name was Lillian, and she vanished in 1953, never found. Each discovery layered over the last like sediment, forming a foundation of truth that felt older than any of us, and with each new piece came a sharper question. Why had my mother tried to bury this? What was she trying to protect us from? Or protect them from? I began to dream about them, not in the surreal, nightmarish way that cliches predict, but in soft, half-lit memories that weren't mine, moments of stillness and fear, of whispered conversations behind closed doors and the weight of a key in a child's hand, the sound of footsteps echoing through an empty corridor. I would wake up with names on my lips, names I didn't know I'd remembered. It was around this time that Father grew quiet in a different way, not just absent but suspiciously aware. His silences weren't avoidance anymore. They were strategy, as though he was watching to see how far I'd go, how much I'd uncover before he had to step in. One morning, as I passed him in the hallway, he stopped me with a single question, low and sharp. Did you go into the North Crawl Space? I hadn't. I didn't even know we had one. But the way he asked, the way his eyes narrowed just slightly and then relaxed when I said no, told me that I would. And that he knew it. He didn't warn me. He didn't stop me. And I think part of him wanted me to find it, to take the burden from his shoulders because he carried it too long. That afternoon, I found the old floor plan buried under paperwork in the back office. And sure enough, there was a small chamber unmarked on the modern diagrams, tucked behind the wall where the portraits hung. It wasn't a room, not yet, but the idea of it sat in my mind like a stone in my stomach. That night, I sat in front of the portraits until the house fell quiet, the kind of quiet that only grief can build, and I listened. Not for voices, not for ghosts, but for memory, for history, for the sound of truth tried to be heard beneath decades of silence. I looked at each face and tried to speak their names aloud, tried to give them the dignity of recognition, but my throat clenched with each syllable, my breath catching on the weight of responsibility, of inheritance, of whatever it was that linked these strangers to our blood. I could feel Anna watching me from the stairs, silent, distant, and I knew then that she remembered more than I did, maybe more than she wanted to, and that whatever we were uncovering was going to come at a price none of us were ready to pay. But still, I couldn't stop, because now I wasn't just chasing answers. I was chasing our family, the pieces of ourselves lost to time and secrecy and sorrow, the ghosts now the dead, but of choices never spoken aloud, of memories sealed behind oil and canvas. And in the stillness of that night, I began to understand these portraits weren't just art. They were evidence. Of what? I wasn't yet sure. But I knew the only way forward was through the wall. And soon I would find the door. The house changed in ways I couldn't measure, not in creaks or shadows or chill drafts, but in something quieter, something internal, like the air began carrying the weight of every word left unsaid, every moment of grief we had refused to name, and it became a place where silence didn't just linger. It grew, pressed down, made a home in our throats until speaking became impossible, And the longer we lived under its roof with those portraits on the wall, the less. It felt like a home and more like a mausoleum built for the living. Anna barely spoke now, her days passing like whispers behind closed doors, and when I asked if she'd eaten, if she'd slept, if she needed anything, she would nod or shake her head but never meet my eyes, like she couldn't bear to look at me and see the resemblance of the man in the third portrait, the one with the hollowed cheeks and dark rings under his eyes, the one who looked enough like our grandfather to make me wonder what else had been passed down in our blood besides stubbornness and sorrow. Father retreated even further into himself, his routine reduced to a carousel of ritualized avoidance. Coffee at 6, the armchair by the window at noon, whiskey by 5, always alone, always staring out or inward but never at us, and I caught him one morning in front of the portrait of Judith, the one who died young, his fingers hovering just over the canvas like he wanted to reach into it. Like something about her face broke him in a way I hadn't seen before. He didn't know I was watching, and in that moment, his face crumpled, a quiet collapse of a man who had held himself together for far too long. And I realized then that whatever the portraits meant, they meant something deeply personal to each of us, like mirrors angled to show us not who we are, but who we've tried desperately not to become. I stopped sleeping in my room. I couldn't. The air in there felt thick, wrong, like the walls had begun to breathe with a rhythm not my own, and instead I took to the downstairs sofa, blankets piled around me, journal in hand, documenting everything because I didn't trust memory anymore, didn't trust that what I felt was entirely mine, and every creak in night felt like a footstep just one room away, every shift of the floorboard a reminder that we were not alone, not in the supernatural sense, but in the deeply human one, the horrifying understanding that the past does not die just because no one speaks of it. I found myself talking to the portraits, not in delusion, but out of desperation, because they were the only faces in the house that seemed to hold anything resembling clarity. Even if it was painted and still, I told Judith about Anna, about how I worried she was slipping away and I didn't know how to reach her anymore. And I told Bernard that father was drinking again and that I hated him a little for giving up. And I whispered to the boy with the curls that I wished I could remember who he was. Because something in me hurt when I looked at him. A deep ache like loss without memory. And in those moments, I felt less alone, not comforted, but recognized, as if my grief had been recorded in layers of oil decades before I'd ever been born. I don't know when it happened exactly, but eventually we stopped crossing paths entirely. The house became a set of disconnected routes, each of us drifting through it on separate circuits like satellites around a dying star. And it wasn't avoidance anymore. It was defense, self-preservation, the instinct to stay quiet in a house that had grown too loud with memory and pain. The kitchen went unused for days. The lights in the hallway began to flicker, and no one bothered to replace them. Dust collected in corners, and no one wiped it away. We had all become versions of the portraits. Static, still, unblinking, watching but not intervening. The wall of portraits had become its own center of gravity, something none of us could truly turn our backs on. And more than once I caught Anna standing there in the dark, barefoot, unmoving, her face inches in the canvas, like she was trying to merge with the image, trying to become part of that frozen world where nothing changed, nothing hurt, and everything could be understood in the depth of a painted eye. I wanted to scream at her, to pull her back, to force her into the present. But something in me knew that to break the spell would be to break her, and so I stood silently behind her, watching her watch them, wondering if she saw something I didn't, or if she simply needed to be seen by something that couldn't hurt her back. I began spending more time in the office, digging through papers, letters, boxes of receipts, and photographs, anything that might explain how these portraits had come to us, how our mother, who had always been so guarded, so careful, had managed to hide something this massive from us for so long. And I started building timelines, pinning connections together with string and pushpins like I was solving a crime, because in many ways I was not one of blood or violence, but a memory of silence, of choices made and buried so deep that they were never meant to be found. I found more letters, more names, more fragments of what was beginning to look like a deliberate act of forgetting, and the more I learned, the more I felt like a stranger in my own family. Like I had inherited a house full of locked doors and no keys, and the people who once lived here, my own flesh and blood, had all left their shadows behind in the shape of canvas and wooden frame. I started having nosebleeds, small ones at first, just enough to stain the edge of a tissue, but soon more frequent, heavier, always in the same hallway, always when I walked past a wall. I know the rational part of me screamed for a doctor, for science. The quieter part, the part that had begun to believe in the emotional architecture of the house, knew this was not illness. It was pressure, too much history pressing outward, too much silence finally finding its way into the bloodstream. I didn't tell Anna. I didn't tell Father. There was no one to tell. We were ghosts in our own story, orbiting one another without ever truly touching, and I knew it was building toward something, some moment, some unveiling, some final crack in the facade that would split the house in two and show us what we had spent our lives refusing to see. And that door behind the portraits? I stopped thinking about it as metaphor. I started thinking about it as real. IT happened on a Sunday, one of those hollowed-out days where time drags at a limp body, and the light outside feels more like a warning than comfort. And I remember it not because the weather was strange or the silence in the house felt heavier than usual, but because I had finally made a decision to stop waiting for answers to come from dreams or ghosts or fragments of old letters, and to start looking with my own hands, to open whatever had been closed, to cross the threshold no one else would. And I stood in front of the portrait wall just after noon, the sun casting long slants of amber light across the floorboards, and I pressed my palms flat against the wallpaper between the frames, not entirely sure what I expected, but knowing with an awful certainty that something lay behind it, something more than plaster and insulation. And when I knocked, 3 quick, shallow raps, I felt it, the dull thud of something hollow, something that didn't match the rest of the wall, and adrenaline surged up my spine so fast I nearly vomited, because it wasn't just a sound. It was confirmation, a ripple of truth spreading out from that single point. And I went to the garage, found a utility knife, and with trembling fingers I slit the wallpaper along the seam where 2 of the largest portraits met, and beneath it, hidden in dust and decades of neglect, was a narrow, wooden door no more than 4 feet tall, its hinges rusted, the knob old brass, cool to the touch despite the heat of the day, and for a long moment I just stared at it, half expecting it to vanish or swing open on its own, but it didn't. It waited patient and still, like something that knew it would be open eventually, and saw no need to rush, and with a breath I wasn't sure I'd ever find again, I turned the knob and pulled. The smell hit me first, not rot or death or anything dramatic, but the deep, musty scent of forgotten things, paper and wood and time itself, and the darkness inside was absolute. So I grabbed the flashlight from the hallway drawer and stepped in, ducking low beneath the warped frame, my heart pounding so hard it blurred my vision, and the beam of light swept across what I first mistook for a crawl space, but quickly realized was something far more deliberate. It was a room, narrow and long, about 6 feet wide and 10 feet deep, with shelves built into the walls, stacks of boxes, and in the far corner, an old writing desk covered in cloth that had once been white, but now looked like age bone, and I moved slowly, as if the air was thicker inside, heavier with something unseen, and when I pulled the cloth away from the desk, I saw them, dozens of photographs, some framed, some loose, some curling at the edges with age, all of them the same people as in the portraits, but not posed, not. Painted, real photos, moments caught in time, Judith smiling shyly on a porch step, Bernard holding a child I had never seen before, Lillian in front of what looked like the very house we stood in, her eyes bright with life and promise. And I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, because these weren't strangers. They were us or pieces of us, generations tangled in a web of silence and shame. And among the photos were journals, yellowed pages filled with cramped handwriting. And I opened the top one with shaking fingers, reading the first line. They said to destroy the paintings, but I couldn't, not after what we did. And I sank to the floor, legs numb, as the wave of it all crashed over me in waves. And I read page after page of confessions, of family secrets passed down and covered up, of a house that had always known more than its inhabitants, of mental illness labeled as possession, of children sent away and never spoken of again, of a fire no one talked about that had started not in the kitchen, but in a locked bedroom where one of the children, our great aunt maybe, had been kept for years, her name scribbled in the margins like an afterthought, and every word felt like a nail driven deeper into the coffin of what I thought our family was. I don't know how long I stayed in that room, maybe hours, maybe just minutes stretched in by horror, but eventually I emerged, crawling out like someone reborn into a colder world, and Anna was waiting in the hallway, her face blank but her eyes wet, and she said nothing as I closed the little door behind me, sealing it back in the wall. But she reached out and took my hand and led me to the kitchen, where Father sat at the table, staring at an untouched cup of coffee, and he looked up at me, like he already knew, like he'd known all along. And when I asked him why we were never told, why this room existed, why the portraits were never taken down, his face crumpled the same way it had in front of Judith's painting, and he whispered, "Because remembering it makes it real." And I understood then that we had inherited more than furniture and photographs and grief. We had inherited a legacy of silence, of choosing to forget the things that made us ashamed, of burying our dead, not just in the ground, but in the walls. And now that I had opened it, now that I had read it, we couldn't go back. We were part of the story now. And so were they. The days that followed the discovery of the hidden room were unlike anything I'd ever known, not loud or violent, but marked by a quiet, devastating clarity, like the sound of slow crack running through glass, invisible at first, but deepening by the hour until you realize the entire thing is about to shatter, and everything that had once been buried beneath silence was now exhumed, not with ceremony or forgiveness, but with the blunt finality of facts that no one wanted to know. One could unlearn. I spent those days reading everything I could from the journals, the letters, the scraps of receipts and telegrams and family Bible pages annotated with dates that didn't match official records. And the story that emerged was worse than any fiction, not because of murder or horror in the traditional sense, but because of what it said about who we were, who we'd always been, the kind of people who looked the other way when things got too strange, who buried our mentally ill and called it mercy, who changed names, rewrote timelines, and painted portraits not to remember but to recast the truth into something that could be hung on a wall without shame. Anna barely came out of her room, though sometimes I'd hear her pacing or softly crying. Her grief turned inward, now fused with guilt she didn't earn but couldn't escape. And when I did see her, she looked older, not in years but in weight, as if time had settled differently on her shoulders now that she knew our mother hadn't just inherited silence, but participated in it, complicit in the decision to erase entire lives from our family's narrative, especially the child, the one they only ever referred to the margins as L, the child born to Judith in secret, hidden away in this house, the child who wasn't buried in the cemetery plot with the rest of the family, but was simply never mentioned again. And something in me broke when I read that letter from Miriam, written decades earlier, begging our mother to acknowledge what had happened, to stop pretending it never did, and receiving only silence in return. I wanted to ask my father about Elle, about what he knew, what he remembered, but every time I opened my mouth to speak, I saw the lines deepen in his face, saw the shame that curled around him like smoke, and I knew he wouldn't answer. Not because he couldn't, but because some truths, once said aloud, destroy the people who carry them, and maybe it carried them too long to survive their release. So I kept reading. I traced the connections, how Judith's pregnancy had been hidden from the community, how Bernard had paid off the midwife, how the child had been raised for a time in the attic before being moved to the basement room that no longer existed, how the fire that later gutted part of the house had been blamed on faulty wiring, but was almost certainly an act of desperation. Perhaps even from L himself, who, according to the final, unsent letter found at the bottom of the drawer, was still alive when it happened. Still in the house, still waiting for someone to open the door. That was the part that haunted me. Not the portraits, not the hidden room, but the idea of a child growing into silence, into invisibility, watching his family walk past his prison every day and choosing to forget. And now, decades later, here we were, living with his image on our wall and calling it heritage. I don't know how Anna found the courage to ask, but one morning she appeared at the breakfast table where Father and I sat in our usual wordless ritual, and her voice, though cracked, was steady as she asked, "Did Mom ever tell you who the boy was?" And Father froze, not like someone caught in a lie, but like someone struck by lightning, his spoon midair, his eyes distant, and after a moment he set it down and said he was family. And that was all he said, all he would say, and then he rose and left the room. And the silence he left behind was not empty, but full of mourning, not just for the child we never knew, but for the people we had become by not knowing him. That night, Anna and I returned to the hidden room, this time with purpose, not to uncover but to acknowledge, to give witness. And together we sat on the floor, laying out the photographs like puzzle pieces, trying to recreate a narrative from fragments, naming each face, whispering the names as though saying them aloud could undo the forgetting. And when we reached the final photo, the one of the boys standing in front of the same wall where his portrait now hung, eyes wide and mouth slightly parted, I felt something shift inside me, a deep and permanent alteration of identity, because I could no longer see him as mystery or a symbol. He was real, he was blood, and I had walked past him my entire life without knowing I owed him everything. We sat in that room until the light faded, and when we left, we didn't close the door all the way, not because we wanted to return, but because to close it felt like repeating the same sin, and we couldn't live with that anymore. We returned to the hallway and looked at the portraits one last time, and for the first time, they looked back at us not with warning or accusation, but with relief, like they had been waiting not to haunt, but to be seen. And in that moment, I realized that the haunting had never been theirs. It had always been ours. There's a particular kind of silence that follows the truth, not the peaceful, cathartic kind that brings closure, but the kind that lingers like smoke after a house fire, thick and toxic and impossible to breathe through without coughing up everything you try to keep inside. And that's what filled the house in the days after Anna and I unearthed the past, not just in the literal sense of the documents and photographs and letters now spread across the dining room table like a crime scene, but in the emotional gravity that pulled all of us into our own private corners, orbiting one another like broken planets with no tether left to hold us together. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the knowledge of what had been done, what had been allowed, hung in the air with every creaking floorboard and flickering light bulb, and the portraits, once mysterious and quietly oppressive, now fell heavy with meaning. Each painted face a portrait not of strangers, but of complicity, of roles played in a generational story of concealment and guilt, and though none of us said it outright, we all began to move differently in the house, slower, more cautious, as if walking through the rooms might stir up even more truths we weren't ready for. Father stopped coming downstairs. He stayed in his room, door locked, curtains drawn, and when I knocked, when Anna slipped notes beneath the door or left meals untouched on the hallway floor, there was no response, not even the sound of movement, and part of me feared we had already lost him to the weight of what he knew and could no longer deny. I think Anna resented me for pushing it, for opening the door, for reading the journals and demanding we really look, at who our family had been. And one night she confronted me in the kitchen, her voice quiet but filled with fury I'd never heard from her before, accusing me not of lies but of destruction, of taking something fragile and burning it down in the name of truth. And though I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to say that knowing was better than living inside a myth, I couldn't, because some part of me wondered if she was right, if we would have been better off never knowing, if the dead deserved the dignity of silence and the living deserved the mercy of forgetfulness. But it was too late for that. The house itself seemed to know. The walls groaned louder, the cold settled deeper, the power flickered more frequently, and whether it was coincidence or the simple result of a home long neglected, it didn't matter. It felt like punishment or maybe retribution, and the portraits became harder to look at, not because they were frightening, but because they had become too real, too personal, and each time I passed them, I felt the sting of shame crawl up my spine. I found myself talking to Lillian, her portrait hanging above the stairs, her expression unreadable, caught between serenity and sorrow, and I asked her questions I knew she couldn't answer. What was it like to hide your child in the attic? Did you regret it? Did you ever try to get him out? And though no voice replied, I imagined what she might say. That regret becomes a kind of wallpaper, something you learn to ignore until it's the only thing holding your world together. The journals became more erratic the deeper I read. The final entry scrawled and fragmented, a clear descent into mental illness that had been called hysteria or possession or madness by the men in the family, but was clearly something else. Trauma untreated, pain unacknowledged, generations of women written out of their own stories and turned into cautionary tales instead of human beings. And I saw it in Anna's face too now, the slow erosion, the fatigue, the internal collapse that comes not from weakness, but from holding too much pain for too long, without anyone to carry it with you. She started disappearing for hours at a time, no explanation, no phone calls. And when I asked where she went, she just shrugged and said, away, as though any place outside this house could offer something we didn't even know we needed: space, silence, air. I considered leaving too, considered packing a bag and walking away from all of it, the house, the portraits, the truth, but something in me held fast. Not guilt, not loyalty, but a kind of grim responsibility. Like once you look the truth in the eye, you owe it something, and I couldn't just leave it buried again. I spent nights sitting on the floor of the hidden room, not reading, not even thinking, just existing in that tight space where history felt close enough to touch, where I could feel the presence of everything would fail to honor, not as ghosts, but as memories, each one etched into the grain of the wood, and the smell of dust and the cold that never left the floor. I began to wonder if I was losing myself too, if this house had a way of bending time and identity, erasing the present by overwhelming it with the past. And when I looked in the mirror some mornings, I couldn't tell if I looked more like my mother or like Judith, and the thought terrified me in ways I couldn't explain, because I didn't know if that meant I was continuing the story or trying to end it. And still the house stood. Still, the portraits watched. Still, we endured, not because we were strong, but because we had nowhere else to go, and the only way out was through the story, through the pain, through the truth we had unearthed and now had to carry, no matter what it cost. IT happened not with screaming or slammed doors, but with a soft, shattering thud of something vital breaking, an argument that didn't start like one, just a conversation over tea that had gone cold. Sitting across from Anna in the dim light of the living room, the silence stretching long and brittle between us as a house seemed to hold its breath, and I asked her, quietly, almost gently, if she was still going to the library like she said she was, if that was really where she disappeared every afternoon. And the way she looked at me in that moment, half glare, half wounded animal, told me the answer long before her voice did. But she replied anyway, her words clipped and shaking. Why do you care? You're not the only one allowed to run from this. And it hit me harder than I expected, that sudden accusation, because I hadn't thought I was running. I thought I was facing it, carrying the truth on my back like penance. But maybe she was right. Maybe we were both running in different directions, and I said so, not with malice, but with exhausted honesty, and something in her cracked open then, her shoulders folding in like wings, her mouth twisting into a bitter laugh, and she said, "You act like you're the only one who lost her, like you're the only one grieving, like digging through dead people's letters is healing instead of another form of control." I wanted to deny it, to tell her that it wasn't like that I was doing this for both of us, but I couldn't, because part of me had enjoyed being the one who knew more, the one who uncovered the puzzle, the one who finally had something to hold on to in the chaos of grief, and she saw that, and she hated it. "You think finding the truth makes you the hero," she whispered, her voice low and trembling, "but you're just doing what they did, choosing your version of the story and expecting me to live inside it." And I felt the words land in my chest like fists, not because they were unfair, but because they were true. And before I could stop myself, I stood up too fast, the chair scraping back across the floor, and I snapped. At least I'm doing something. At least I didn't spend the last 6 months hiding in the attic pretending Mom might walk back in the door. And that was a moment, the exact instant the air changed, like something ancient and feral cracked between us. And she stood up too, face flushed, hands shaking, and she screamed. Not words, just sound, raw and aching like a pressure valve exploding. And then the words came, all of them at once. Years of resentment and sorrow and confusion, spilling out of her in waves. How she was the one who found our mother after the overdose. How she was the one who cleaned up the mess while I stayed gone, chasing my own life. How she had kept the house together while I had the luxury of distance and detachment. And how now, when it finally all fell apart, I wanted to waltz back in and play the martyr. And I didn't know what to say, because she was right about that too. I had stayed away, not out of malice, but because I didn't know how to come home to grief, didn't know how to sit with pain without trying to fix it. And now that I had returned, all I could do was dig and reveal and analyze, while she had been holding the weight alone, suffocating under a silence that I mistook for apathy. We stood there, breathing hard, the distance between us no longer emotional but physical, a chasm carved by time and loss. And it was then that the portraits came back into focus, their painted eyes bearing witness to our collapse. And I thought about how many of them had likely stood like this. Siblings, lovers, parents, torn apart by secrets they couldn't voice until it was too late. And I didn't want that for us. Didn't want to become another set of faces in a frame with a story no one would tell. And so I stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, and said the only thing I could think of that wasn't offensive or explanatory or dismissive. I said, "I'm sorry," and I meant it not just for this moment, but for all of it, For the years I'd missed, for the silence I'd let grow between us, for the weight I'd thrown on her shoulders without ever asking if she could carry it. She didn't speak right away, but her shoulders trembled and her face twisted into something between anguish and relief, and then she collapsed into me, sobbing so violently it felt like she might come apart in my arms, and I held her as tightly as I could, not to fix her, not to silence her, but just to be there, finally, fully. And in that moment I realized that this was the real haunting. The grief we had carried alone for so long it had become a ghost in the walls, and only now, breaking open, could it finally begin to leave. We stood like that for a long time, until the sun dipped low and the house grew dim, and even the portrait seemed softer in the fading light, like they, too, understood that something had shifted, something had finally been faced. We didn't fix everything in that moment. How could we? But we stopped pretending we were fine, and sometimes that's the first miracle. Sometimes that's the door you need to open most. I end the days that followed our collapse. Something softer took hold in the house. Not peace, not yet, but a kind of tentative stillness, like the surface of a lake just after a storm, the water calm, but the depths still shifting with unseen currents. And though Anna and I no longer walked past each other in silence, or spoke only in barbed glances, there was still a weariness in our voices, like two people learning to speak a new language made of apology and grief, and the house, ever attuned to our rhythms, seemed to respond in kind, the creaks less frequent, the cold less biting, as if the walls themselves were adjusting to this new, quieter war. We didn't talk much about the hidden room anymore, not because it no longer mattered, but because it had become something sacred, a reliquary of pain and truth that we both knew we couldn't live in forever, and instead we turned our attention to the space we could control, the now, the present, the living moments that still stretched out ahead of us if we dared to claim them. One afternoon, I found Anna on the back steps, barefoot, legs pulled to her chest, staring out the overgrown garden that had once been our mother's pride, and without speaking I sat beside her, letting the silence between us breathe without demanding anything of it. And after a while she said, "We should plant something." And I knew it wasn't about flowers or vegetables or landscaping. It was about growth, rebirth, choosing life after so much loss. And though it felt impossibly small compared to the weight of what we had uncovered, I nodded and said, "Okay," because sometimes healing begins with something that's simple, but not everything could be repaired with silence and time. Father still hadn't come down from his room, hadn't answered the knock at the door, and one night, unable to carry the uncertainty any longer, I forced a lock, heart pounding, expecting the worst, but found him sitting in his armchair in the dark, still alive, still whole, but thinner, like something inside him had been eaten away by memory. And when I stepped into the room, he didn't look at me, just kept staring out the window at the night, and I asked him the question I hadn't dared to ask, since we opened the door behind the portraits. "Did you know about Elle?" And at first he didn't answer, didn't move, but then he said, "Your mother told me once, a long time ago after Judith died," and his voice was so fragile, so broken, it made my throat tighten. And I asked him why he never told us, why he let us grow up in a house full of secrets. And he said, "Because I thought it would end with her," and those words, so simple, so utterly naive, cut through me like a blade, because it had never ended, not with her, not with him, not with anyone who chose silence over truth. And I realized that he had believed, truly believed, that not speaking out loud would protect us, would somehow break the cycle. But all it did was bury the rot deeper, and now that it had surfaced, he didn't know how to live with it. I sat down across from him and said, "We don't want to destroy you. We just want to know who we are." And finally, he looked at me, eyes wet and wild, and he whispered, "I don't know anymore." And there was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. We talked for hours that night, not about everything, not all at once, but enough to bridge the gap that had widened over years of unspoken grief. And by the time I left the room, I didn't feel peace, but I felt something close understanding. And sometimes that's more powerful than forgiveness. Anna and I began cleaning the house. Not in haste, not to forget, but to reclaim it, one room at a time, dusting shelves, opening windows, letting the light back in, and we left the portraits where they were, not as monument of horror, but as acknowledgments of the story we came from, the people whose choices shaped our blood, whose sins we refused to repeat. We argued sometimes about what to do with the journals, whether to burn them or preserve them, whether to tell anyone what we'd found, but we argued like people who cared who wanted to do right even if we didn't agree on what that looked like, and in that there was a kind of redemption. We decided to leave the hidden room untouched, not sealed, not erased, but left as it was, because truth should remain accessible, even when it's painful. And we placed a small chair inside it, a light, a single-framed photo of Elle. And though we didn't say aloud, I think we both felt it. An apology, a promise, a prayer. And in that space between ruin and reconciliation, we began, tentatively, to live again, not in defiance of the past, but in conversation with it, holding in our hands like something sharp and beautiful, dangerous but necessary, because you cannot change what came before, but you can decide how you carry it forward. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough that I started writing letters, not to anyone in particular, and certainly not to send, but because the words inside me had grown too heavy to carry silently, and I needed a place to put them, a way to make sense of the mess we'd inherited and the people we'd become inside it. And so I wrote, to our mother, to Elle, to myself, to the house, even to the portraits, because in some way each of them had held a part of the truth, each of them a mirror reflecting. Something I hadn't been willing to look at until the walls themselves started whispering. The first letter was the hardest, because it was to her. To the woman I still didn't fully understand, the mother who had laughed easily and made pancakes on Sundays, who kissed our foreheads and kept our nightmares at bay, but who also carried secrets like weapons tucked in her ribs, who taught us to be careful with pain and more careful with truth. And I wrote, you could have told us. And the words bled through the page like accusation, like grief's final gasp, and yet I followed it with, but I think I understand why you didn't. Because somewhere in that shadow between betrayal and protection was the reality of what she endured, what she must have witnessed. And I imagine her as a girl in the same house, tiptoeing past locked doors, hearing things no child should hear, being told to smile and not ask questions. And I realized that maybe the silence wasn't cowardice, but survival, and though I couldn't forgive all of it, I could try to understand it. And that, I think, is the beginning of peace. Anna wrote too, though she never let me read them. And some days she burned her letters in the fireplace, watching the ashes spiral up into flue like smoke from a long-extinguished fire. And I knew that for her, the act of letting go had to be visible, had to be ritual, because she carried the weight differently than I had. She bore it in her body, in her breath, in her silences, and letting it out required flame. Father, to my knowledge, never wrote anything down, but he started coming to breakfast again, sitting quietly at the table with his coffee, sometimes staring out the window, sometimes watching us with eyes that held more sorrow than speech. And once, without prompting, he looked at me and said, there was a night your mother almost told you. You were 7. You had a fever. She sat beside your bed for hours, and I didn't ask what stopped her, because I already knew. Fear, the same fear that had run down through our bloodline like a river, fear of breaking what little wholeness remained. And even though I didn't remember that night, I felt it echo in my bones, the story that almost came out and didn't. I kept all my letters in a shoebox beneath my bed, never folded neatly, never arranged in any order, just a growing pile of truth I wasn't ready to bury. And in those pages I said things I hadn't said aloud, like how I still dreamt of the porch or hallway, and woke up sometimes feeling watched, not by ghosts, but by memory itself, and how I worried that someday, despite everything, I would become one of them, not the people in the paintings, but the kind of person who forgets, who turns away, who pretends not to see what's too difficult to confront. I wrote about Elle, often trying to imagine what his voice sounded like, what kind of laugh he had, whether he ever looked out a window and imagined a different life. And I wrote about Judah too, wondering what it felt like to paint your sorrow into canvases no one would understand for generations. And I told him I was sorry, not just for what happened, but for how long it took to look them in the eye. We never decided to leave the house. Not really, though we talk about it sometimes, made lists of cities, imagined lives somewhere else, but always circled back to the same truth. This place, for all its damage, was ours, and maybe staying wasn't about clinging to the past, but about reclaiming it, about filling the rooms with a different kind of story, one built not on silence, but on acknowledgement. The hidden room remained untouched, except for the occasional candle left on the desk, or the photo of Elle that Anna moved slightly to face the door, and it felt less like a secret now and more like a shrine, not to sadness, but to memory, a room that told the truth even when no one else could. Sometimes I imagine future children in this house, laughing down the halls, making new sounds to cover the old ones, and I wondered what we would tell them, what story we would pass down when the time came. And I made a promise to myself then, silent and steady, that we would not let them inherit ghosts, only names, only truths, and that they would know who came before not as legends or shadows, but as people who heard and healed and tried. I ended each letter the same way. I remember you. I see you. You mattered. And in those words, I think, I found the closest thing to forgiveness I could offer. Or maybe the closest thing to peace I could live with. It came not as a scream or a letter or a whisper confession in the dark, but as a photograph, an image I had missed a dozen times before, buried in the bottom of a journal. I thought I had already scoured for meaning, a page that had been stuck to the back cover with time and humidity. Its edges curled like it didn't want to be seen, and when I peeled it free, my hands shaking from the weight of everything we had already endured, I saw a photo of L that stopped my breath entirely. Not because it was different from the others, but because if we were standing next to shoulder, a hand on his back, and the face, though younger, cleaner, less gaunt, was unmistakable. It was our grandfather, father's father, a man I barely remembered, who died when I was young, always spoken with reverence and distance, never warmth, and in that frozen image, in the crooked smile and posture of casual familiarity, I saw the final, unspeakable truth. L hadn't been Judith's child. He had been Judith's brother. And our grandfather had raised him like a burden, like a secret, not as an orphan nephew, but as a shameful sibling, the child of a second wife no one ever mentioned, a woman institutionalized after childbirth, whose name had been struck from every record I could find. And that meant God. It meant everything we believed was a layer removed from a truth. It wasn't just hidden pain. It was rewritten blood. The house hadn't just been a prison for grief. It had been the site of erasure, of deliberate renaming, where identities were changed and children became someone else's problem. And if L had been the youngest child of our great-grandfather, that meant his story, his confinement, his vanishing, had happened with the full knowledge of not just the older generation, but the one we came from directly. It wasn't inherited trauma. It was a chosen one. And suddenly I saw our entire family line not as victims of misfortune or silence, but as active participants in a story of control and image and fear. I brought the photograph to Father, placed it gently on the kitchen table where he now spent his mornings tracing the edges of his coffee mug with one trembling finger, and when he looked at it, his face drained of color, not from recognition, but from memory, the kind that doesn't surface gently but crashes like ice breaking beneath your feet. And he closed his eyes and whispered, "He used to scream at night." And I realized he had known, not everything, maybe, but enough, and he had stayed silent because that was what men in our family had always done, covered, repressed, buried, until the past became a shape on the wall no one dared to speak to. "Did you ever see him?" I asked, and his eyes opened, glassy and tired, and he said, "I heard him," and the tremor in his voice made me wonder how many nights he had lain in bed, a child himself, while his uncle, his brother, cried through the walls, and how many mornings he woke up and pretended not to know, because his father told him it wasn't his business. The photograph changed something in Anna, too. She held it like a relic, fingers trembling, eyes wet, and I saw her finally grasp the depth of it, not just emotional inheritance, but the cruelty, the way secrets don't just haunt, they calcify, become part of the walls, part of the rules, and she said, they didn't just forget him, they erased him. And I nodded, unable to speak, because that was a truth none of us were prepared for, not loss, but deletion. L hadn't died tragically. He had been disappeared, his name, his story, his mother, all wiped clean in service of myth that kept our family intact in the eyes of society. And yet, somehow his portrait remained. That was a part that undid me. Of all the decisions made, all the erasures, someone, perhaps Judith, perhaps his mother in secret, had ensured his face would survive. And it had, on our wall, in our hallway, in our lives. Not as a ghost, but as evidence. And now, standing before that painting one final time, Anna beside me, the photograph held between us like proof of life, I realized that the haunting had never been supernatural. It had been moral. It had been human. It had been the echo of a crime so silent it took generations to hear it. And now, at last, we had, and we could not, would not, pretend otherwise again. It's been almost a year now since we opened the wall and found the room, since the truth rose like smoke through our quiet lives and wrapped itself around everything we thought we understood about who we were and where we came from. And though the house hasn't changed in any visible way, the floor still creaks in the same places, the windows still rattle in the spring wind, and the portrait still hangs silently on the hallway wall. Everything. Inside it feels different. Not lighter, not healed, but awake, like a place that has finally exhaled after holding its breath for generations. Anna lives here still. And so, though we've each carved out new corners of the house, spaces that belong to our present selves, not the versions of us that used to pass each other like shadows. And though we don't talk about the hidden room every day, we acknowledge it now the way you acknowledge weather or grief. Something always there, always, capable of returning, but no longer held in secrecy. Father passed away quietly 3 months ago, not dramatically, not tragically, just slowly, as if the weight of memory had finally completed its work and given him permission to rest. And in the days before he went, he said very little. But he did ask once, in a whisper that cracked at the edges, if we ever forgave him, and I didn't lie. I told him we were still learning how to, that some forgiveness comes slow and some never arrives, and he nodded as though that, too, was a kind of peace. We buried him in the family plot beside Mother, beneath a tree that Anna chose because it blooms yellow in the spring, and we placed no photograph, just a small stone with his name, simple and clean, because in the end, we decided that legacy shouldn't be about stories we tell the world, but about what we choose to carry forward, and what we choose to finally put down. The portraits remain, not as warnings now, but as testimonies, and some days we catch ourselves speaking to them, just small things, mundane things like how the weather's changing or how the neighbor's dog won't stop barking. And though it sounds strange to anyone else, it no longer feels odd to us. They are witnesses, after all, and sometimes that's all any of us need. We kept a photograph of Elle, framed and placed it above the entryway, not hidden, not explained with plaques or labels, but simply present eye level, so no one forgets him again. And as for the letters I wrote, they now live in a hidden room, in a small wooden box beside the desk, where others, if they ever come, can read them or not, but where they will remain as evidence that we remembered, that we named, that we did not let silence win. Anna's garden is blooming. She's planted jasmine and rosemary and lilies, and some mornings she'll pick a handful and place it beneath LS photo like an offering, a gesture that means everything and nothing at once. And I think that's how healing works. Not in grand declarations, but in small consistencies, in choosing every day not to look away. I don't dream of the portraits anymore. I dream of the garden. I dream of the sound of the wind in the attic rafters, of footsteps that no longer carry dread, of the moment when Anna reached for my hand at the bottom of the stairs and didn't let go. And maybe that's all the haunting ever was. The ache of memory asking to be held. We held it. We still do. But now we also let it breathe. And that, I think, is the truest kind of freedom.